Imagine rushing into a hospital, desperate for help, only to be turned away because of the color of your skin. For Jacob Daniels, a life-threatening emergency became a fight for dignity and justice. But what happens next will leave you stunned when the truth comes out. One decision changes everything. Watch as courage and accountability collide in this powerful story of redemption. The sterile glow of fluorescent lights reflected off the polished linoleum floors of Metro General Hospital. Sarah Montgomery adjusted her pristine white lab coat as she stood at the bustling nurses' station. On the surface, she was the epitome of professionalism, her blonde hair tied neatly into a bun, her clipboard tucked tightly under her arm. Patients and colleagues passed by, offering polite smiles that she returned without warmth. Sarah was good at her job, or at least that's what she told herself. Years of experience had honed her efficiency, but her empathy had eroded over time. Beneath the surface of her calm demeanor lay insecurities born from a lifetime of needing to prove herself. These insecurities often expressed themselves in a subtle air of superiority, particularly toward those she unconsciously deemed less deserving. As she skimmed the patient list, her sharp blue eyes flickered with impatience. The names that appeared, a Rodriguez, a Patel, a Daniels, elicited a sigh. She muttered under her breath, another long night. To her, these nights felt endless, a carousel of chaos she thought could be better managed if people just took care of themselves. Across town, Jake Daniels clutched his chest as he stumbled out of his car and toward the hospital's emergency entrance. The sharp, radiating pain in his chest had started hours ago, but Jake, ever the selfless pillar of his community, had ignored it to finish delivering supplies to the local food bank. Jake was a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a deep, calming voice. His life was dedicated to helping others, whether mentoring at-risk youth or organizing neighborhood cleanup drives. Tonight, however, his strength was failing him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed through the sliding glass doors, gripping the edge of the reception desk for support. The receptionist's eyes widened as she saw Jake's condition. "Sir, are you okay? You should sit down. I'll get someone immediately." "Thank you," Jake managed, his voice strained but polite. He glanced around the chaotic waiting room, his instincts as a leader kicking in despite his own emergency. He noticed a young mother soothing a crying child, an elderly man dozing in his wheelchair, and a teenage boy nursing a bloodied hand. He smiled faintly, trying to reassure those around him despite his own growing discomfort. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. The night shift was in full swing, with overworked staff weaving between beds and patients. Monitors beeped incessantly, adding to the cacophony of coughing, murmured prayers, and the occasional raised voice. Sarah Montgomery briskly made her rounds, her stiletto heels clicking against the floor. She had little patience for what she deemed unnecessary drama. Her colleagues noticed this about her, but rarely confronted her, attributing her curt demeanor to the stress of the job. "Sarah, room 104 needs you," a nurse called as she passed by. "Noted," Sarah replied curtly, making a beeline toward the room. Along the way, she passed a young Latina woman in the hallway, holding her arm awkwardly in a makeshift sling. Sarah barely glanced at her. "Triage will handle that," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Her interactions were efficient but cold, her subtle biases creeping into every dismissive look and clipped word. Sarah prided herself on sticking to protocol, though she often used it as an excuse to sidestep the patients she deemed less cooperative or deserving. When Sarah finally reached the waiting area, she spotted Jake seated in a chair near the reception desk. His face glistened with sweat, and his breathing was labored. The receptionist caught Sarah's attention. "This gentleman needs immediate care. He came in complaining of chest pains." Sarah frowned, her gaze briefly flicking over Jake before returning to the clipboard in her hands. "Chest pains?" she asked flatly. "Has he been triaged yet?" "No, but... Then he'll need to wait his turn," Sarah interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Jake, still clutching his chest, looked up at her with a weak but understanding smile. "I'm sorry to be a bother, Mom," he said, his voice measured despite the pain. I think it might be serious." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're very busy tonight, sir," she said, her tone clipped. "Please take a seat. Someone will see you when they can." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Jake to slump back in his chair, the pain intensifying. The tension in the hospital continued to mount as the hours dragged on. Jake's condition worsened, yet he remained patient, even comforting the young mother sitting nearby. His quiet resilience made him a beacon of calm in the chaotic waiting room. Meanwhile, Sarah's interactions with other patients revealed more of her underlying prejudice. She avoided eye contact with a black teenager who nervously approached the desk to ask a question. She muttered about people not knowing how to use the system. When a Middle Eastern family asked for help filling out forms. As the night wore on, Sarah glanced at Jake from across the room. She noticed his labored breathing and the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, but dismissed it as exaggeration. In her mind, he was another attention seeker who didn't understand how overwhelmed the staff was. Unbeknownst to Sarah, a nurse passing through the waiting area paused by Jake's chair, her expression shifting to concern. "Sir, are you feeling okay?" she asked softly. Jake shook his head. "Not really," he admitted. The nurse's gaze darted toward Sarah, who was engrossed in paperwork at the station. "Wait here," she said. "I'll get someone." As the nurse disappeared into the chaos, Sarah glanced up and noticed Jake looking at her. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Sarah's expression hardened, and she quickly looked away, the unease in her chest masked by her practiced indifference. The stage was set. The quiet tension in the air hinted at a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. The automatic doors of the emergency room slid open, ushering Jake Daniels into the fluorescent-lit chaos of Metro General. His broad frame leaned heavily against the reception desk, his hand pressed against his chest as though trying to steady the pain radiating through him. Sweat soaked through his shirt, and his breaths came in shallow, labored bursts. The young receptionist looked up, startled by his condition. "Sir, are you okay? What's going on?" "Chest pain," Jake managed to gasp, his voice strained but steady. I need help." The receptionist nodded, immediately reaching for the phone. "Stay right here. I'll get someone." As Jake lowered himself onto a nearby chair, his eyes swept over the crowded waiting room. The hum of activity, the distant beeping of monitors, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional cries of a child blurred into the background. Jake could feel the curious eyes of other patients on him, their concern mirroring his own rising fear. Sarah Montgomery, clipboard in hand, strode into the waiting area with her usual brisk efficiency. The receptionist caught sight of her and waved her over. "Nurse Montgomery, this gentleman needs urgent care. He's complaining of severe chest pain," she said, motioning toward Jake. Sarah's eyes flicked toward Jake, her expression impassive. She took in his sweat-drenched shirt and the labored rise and fall of his chest, but instead of concern, a flicker of impatience crossed her face. "Has he been triaged?" she asked curtly. "No, but—" "Then he'll need to wait his turn," Sarah interrupted. She turned her attention back to her clipboard, her tone clipped. "We can't just prioritize every walk-in with vague symptoms. Protocol exists for a reason." The receptionist hesitated, glancing between Sarah and Jake. "But he's in serious pain." "And we'll get to him," Sarah snapped. "When it's his turn." Jake, overhearing the exchange, raised a hand weakly. "I don't mean to cause trouble," he said, his voice thin but calm. "But I really think something's wrong. Please." Sarah approached him, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. "Sir, we're extremely busy tonight," she said, her tone measured but dismissive. "You'll need to be patient. There are other people ahead of you." One of the younger nurses, Amanda, stepped forward, her brow furrowed with concern. "Sarah, maybe we should at least check his vitals. He doesn't look good." Sarah shot Amanda a sharp look, her voice low and firm. "I said we'll get to him. Follow the protocol." Amanda hesitated but stepped back, her concern unspoken but evident in the way she glanced back at Jake. The waiting room grew quieter, tension rippling through the space, as onlookers watched the interaction unfold. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as Jake sat slumped in his chair, his hands still pressed against his chest. His breaths grew shallower, each one more labored than the last. Sweat dripped down his temples, and his vision began to blur. Across the room, Sarah busied herself with paperwork, her back turned to the waiting area. She was vaguely aware of the murmurs growing louder, but she brushed them off as the usual impatience of a packed emergency room. "Excuse me," a woman's voice called out sharply. "This man needs help." Sarah turned just in time to see Jake lurch forward, his body sliding off the chair and onto the floor. Gasps echoed through the room as bystanders leapt to their feet. "Someone do something," the young mother with the crying child shouted, clutching her son tightly. Amanda rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside Jake. "Sir? Can you hear me?" she said, her voice trembling. Sarah froze for a moment, the clipboard slipping slightly from her grasp. Then, with a deep breath, she forced herself to step forward, her movements deliberate. "Clear the area," she barked, kneeling beside Amanda. Jake's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Amanda glanced up at Sarah, panic flickering in her eyes. "He's in cardiac distress. We need to move him now." "We don't know that," Sarah replied sharply, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Get a stretcher." "Jump to conclusions? Are you kidding me?" Amanda shot back, her voice rising. "He's collapsing in front of us, and you want to wait." The tension between the two nurses was palpable, their voices cutting through the shocked silence of the waiting room. Patients stared, their expressions a mixture of fear and outrage. Sarah clenched her jaw, her face flushing with frustration. "I'm following protocol," she snapped. "And I'm in charge here." "Then act like it," Amanda muttered under her breath, turning her attention back to Jake. Jake's body trembled as he clutched his chest, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. His strength was failing him, but he managed to lift his eyes to meet Sarah's. For a moment their gazes locked, his filled with pain and desperation, hers with a flicker of doubt. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. The words hit Sarah like a blow, though she didn't understand why. Her chest tightened, and for a fleeting moment she felt the weight of the situation crashing down on her. Before she could act, Amanda stood abruptly, her face set with determination. "I'm calling a code blue," she announced, turning toward the intercom. "You can't," Sarah began, but Amanda cut her off. "Watch me." As the alarm echoed through the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses rushed into the waiting room, pushing a stretcher ahead of them. They swarmed around Jake, their movements swift and coordinated. Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. The chaos she had tried so hard to control was now spiraling out of her grasp, and for the first time she felt the full weight of her decisions pressing down on her. As Jake was rushed toward the operating room, the waiting room fell into a heavy silence. Bystanders exchanged hushed whispers, their gazes shifting between the empty chair where Jake had been and the stunned figure of Sarah Montgomery. Amanda lingered for a moment, her eyes hard as she looked at Sarah. "You could have cost him his life," she said quietly before walking away. Sarah stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly. The weight of Amanda's words and the judgmental stares of those around her settled heavily on her shoulders. In the distance, the sound of Jake's stretcher wheels echoed through the halls, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the consequences of bias. The blaring sound of the emergency alarm echoed through the hallways as Jacob's stretcher was pushed at full speed toward the operating room. Nurses and doctors surrounded him, their voices urgent and sharp as they relayed instructions and vitals. "BP dropping fast, 80/60, a nurse called out, her voice taut with urgency. "Prep the crash cart," Dr. Patel, the lead surgeon, barked. "We need to stabilize him before we can even think about surgery." Jacob's eyelids fluttered, his once strong and confident demeanor reduced to a fragile shell. His breaths were shallow, his lips tinged with blue. Amanda jogged alongside the team, her face etched with worry. "Hang in there," she whispered, her hand briefly brushing his shoulder. In the corner of the hallway, Sarah stood frozen, her back pressed against the cold, tiled wall. She watched as the stretcher disappeared through the double doors, the sound of Jacob's labored breathing haunting her. Her stomach churned with a mix of guilt and defensiveness. The waiting room buzzed with low murmurs, patients and staff exchanging glances and whispers. The scene they had just witnessed was etched into their minds. The man collapsing, the frantic rush to save him. And most of all, the nurse who had refused to act. A young mother leaned toward the receptionist, her voice hushed but laced with anger. "What kind of hospital lets this happen?" "That nurse." She just stood there. "I saw it too," an older man chimed in, shaking his head. "He begged for help, and she ignored him." Meanwhile, Amanda stormed into the nurse's station, slamming her clipboard onto the counter. "I don't care what protocol she's hiding behind," she snapped to a colleague. "This isn't about paperwork. That man almost died because she couldn't see past her own bias." In the corner, Sarah busied herself with charts, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to appear unaffected. Her ears burned as snippets of conversation reached her. Words like discrimination, negligence, and lawsuit floated in the air, cutting through her composure. The quiet tension of the waiting room shattered when Jacob's family burst through the doors. His sister, Monique, was the first to arrive, her face pale and streaked with tears. Behind her, their elderly mother leaned heavily on a cane, her hands shaking with worry. "Where is he?" Monique demanded, her voice cracking. "Where's my brother?" Amanda approached them cautiously, her expression soft with sympathy. "He's in surgery," she explained. "The doctors are doing everything they can." Monique's eyes narrowed as they landed on Sarah, who was standing at the edge of the room, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "You," she said, her voice low and trembling with restrained fury. "Are you the nurse who ignored him?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her silence spoke volumes. "You let him suffer," Monique continued, her voice rising. "You let him collapse in front of everyone while you stood there and did nothing. How could you?" I was following protocol," Sarah stammered, her voice thin. "I didn't realize it was that serious." "Didn't realize," Monique cut her off, her voice breaking. "He told you he was in pain. He begged you. And you still turned him away." Sarah took a step back, her chest tightening under the weight of Monique's words. As the hours dragged on, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. Her colleagues avoided her gaze, their expressions a mix of disappointment and quiet judgment. Amanda's glare was the sharpest of all, her usual warmth replaced by a cold disdain. Sarah retreated to the staff lounge, sinking into a chair with a heavy sigh. She stared at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, her mind racing with justifications. "I followed the rules," she whispered to herself. "I did what I was trained to do. It's not my fault he didn't wait his turn." But the words felt hollow, and deep down she knew it. Flashbacks flickered in her mind, moments from her childhood, sitting at the dinner table while her father ranted about those people taking advantage of the system. His words had been a constant undercurrent in her life, shaping her worldview in ways she hadn't even realized until now. By the next morning, the incident had become the talk of the hospital. Patients who had been in the waiting room recounted the story to others, their outrage spreading like wildfire. "Did you hear about that nurse who refused to help the man in the ER?" an orderly whispered to a doctor in the hallway. "Yeah," the doctor replied, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. If he doesn't make it." Even the hospital administration was buzzing. Sarah was called into a meeting with her supervisor, who regarded her with a stern expression. "Sarah," he began, his voice measured. "We've received multiple complaints about your conduct last night. This is serious." "I understand," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I was just following protocol." "This isn't about protocol," he interrupted. "This is about judgment. And right now, your judgment is in question." Meanwhile, in the intensive care unit, Jacob's condition took a turn for the worse. The doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him, but the delay in treatment had taken its toll. Amanda stood at the foot of his bed, her heart heavy as she watched the monitors beep steadily. "He didn't deserve this," she murmured to Dr. Patel. "No, he didn't," the doctor agreed, his tone grim. "And if he doesn't pull through, someone's going to have to answer for it." As Sarah walked past Jacob's room later that day, she paused, her hand hovering near the doorframe. Through the window, she could see him lying unconscious, tubes and wires snaking around his body. For the first time, the weight of her actions hit her fully. He wasn't just another patient or a name on a chart. He was a man, a brother, a son, a leader in his community, and she had failed him. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes as she turned away, her steps heavy with regret. The sharp beeping of the heart monitor had finally steadied, signaling that Jacob's condition was no longer critical. Though still weak, he opened his eyes, blinking at the fluorescent hospital lights. His family surrounded his bed, their relief palpable. "Thank God," Monique whispered, clutching her mother's hand. Dr. Patel entered the room with a clipboard, his expression cautious but optimistic. "Jacob," he said softly, "you're stable now. But it was touch and go for a while. You'll need rest and observation." Jacob nodded weakly, his voice hoarse. "Thank you, doctor." As the family murmured their gratitude, Amanda entered, hesitant but resolute. "Mr. Daniels," she began, "there's something you need to know. The nurse who delayed your care, there's been an incident." Jacob's gaze sharpened, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "I'll deal with it later," he said, his voice firm despite its weakness. "But for now, there's something you should know." He gestured for Monique to retrieve his bag. She unzipped it, pulling out a folder filled with documents and photographs. Jacob handed it to Amanda, who scanned its contents, her eyes widening. "You're," Amanda stammered, glancing up at him. "A healthcare reform advocate," Jacob confirmed. "I've been working with community leaders to push for change in how hospitals treat underserved populations. I was on my way to finalize a report when this happened." His words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the systemic issues he had fought against and had now personally endured. Meanwhile, in the hospital's break room, a small group of nurses huddled around a smartphone. On the screen, grainy footage from a patient's phone captured the moment Sarah had dismissed Jacob in the waiting room. "You're not critical," Sarah's voice echoed, clipped and dismissive. "There are other patients ahead of you." The camera shook as the person filming whispered, "Can you believe this? He's saying he can't breathe." The footage ended with Jacob collapsing, the gasps of onlookers filling the frame. By the time the video hit social media, it had already been shared hundreds of times. Within hours, it had gone viral. The hashtags healthcare BS and justice for Jacob trended across platforms, sparking heated debates and outrage. At the nurse's station, Amanda scrolled through the comments, her jaw tightening with every post. "This is what systemic racism looks like," she read aloud, her voice trembling with anger. "She needs to be fired immediately." Another nurse leaned over her shoulder. "This is going to blow up," she said. "Management's not going to be able to sweep it under the rug." Sarah's day had started with whispers and icy stares, but by midday the tension had escalated. Her supervisor summoned her to his office, his expression grim. "Sarah," he began, closing the door behind her, "we have a serious problem." She sat stiffly, clutching her hands in her lap. "I was just following protocol," she insisted. Her supervisor leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Protocol doesn't excuse negligence. And now we have a viral video painting you as the face of bias in healthcare." Sarah's breath hitched. Viral video. He turned his monitor to show her the footage. Sarah watched in stunned silence as her own dismissive words played back at her, the damning evidence impossible to deny. "You'll need to step back from your duties until we investigate," he said firmly. "And Sarah, this isn't just about the hospital. This is about trust. If we don't address this, the fallout could be catastrophic." As the public discourse grew, journalists began digging into Jacob's background. News outlets highlighted his work as a community leader, showcasing his initiatives to provide free medical clinics and advocate for healthcare reform. Footage of Jacob speaking at a rally played on televisions across the country. No one, he had said passionately, should be denied care because of their race, their income, or their background. Healthcare is a human right. At home, Monique scrolled through the articles on her phone, tears streaming down her face. "He spent his whole life fighting for people," she murmured to her mother. "And this is how they treat him." Back at her apartment, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through the onslaught of comments flooding her social media accounts. Racist, one comment read. "She shouldn't be allowed near patients." "Is this the kind of care we're supposed to trust?" read another. Her phone buzzed with a call from her mother. Sarah hesitated before answering. "Sarah," her mother said gently, "what's going on?" "I saw the news." "I don't know, Mom," Sarah replied, her voice breaking. "I feel like everything's spiraling out of control." Her mother sighed. "You've always been a good nurse. But maybe it's time to ask yourself, were you really fair to him?" The question hung in the air long after the call ended, forcing Sarah to confront the biases she had long buried beneath professionalism. As Sarah grappled with her guilt, Jacob's character shone through the public narrative. Interviews with his colleagues and friends painted a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. "He's the kind of guy who'd give you the shirt off his back," one friend said. "He's always been about lifting others up." In stark contrast, Sarah's past interactions with patients came under scrutiny. Former patients shared stories of her dismissiveness, particularly toward minorities. "She always acted like she was doing you a favor," one patient said, "like she thought she was better than you." The hospital held a press conference to address the incident, with Jacob's family and legal team in attendance. Sarah watched from the back of the room, her heart pounding as Monique stepped up to the microphone. "My brother is a fighter," Monique said, her voice steady. "But he shouldn't have had to fight for basic care. This isn't just about him. It's about every person who's ever been dismissed or ignored because of who they are." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time, Sarah felt the full weight of what she had done. The sterile white walls of the hospital now felt suffocating to Sarah Montgomery as she sat in the boardroom, facing her supervisor and two members of the HR department. A single folder lay on the table between them, its contents damning. Effective immediately, Nurse Montgomery, her supervisor, began, his tone cold and clipped, "You are suspended pending a full investigation. We will notify you when a decision has been made." Sarah opened her mouth to protest but hesitated, the weight of the viral video and the mounting public outrage silencing her. The once bustling hospital halls seemed eerily quiet as she packed her belongings, avoiding the eyes of her colleagues who watched her departure with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Outside the hospital, the chaos was unavoidable. Camera crews and reporters crowded the entrance, microphones shoved toward anyone who passed. Sarah kept her head low, her heart pounding as she pushed through the throng. "Ms. Montgomery," a reporter called out. "Do you regret refusing care to Jacob Daniels?" Another voice cut through the din. "How do you respond to the claims of racism?" Sarah ignored them. But the questions lingered in her mind, their echoes becoming impossible to escape. At home, her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, messages from friends, family, and complete strangers, all weighing in on the scandal. "You've disgraced yourself," one text read. "Racism has no place in healthcare," said another. Scrolling through social media, Sarah saw the hashtags "Justice for Jacob" and "End Healthcare BS" trending. Videos of Jacob's family speaking out had gone viral, their heartbreak and anger striking a chord with viewers worldwide. Across town, the mood was one of unity and determination. At a local community center, a crowd gathered for a rally organized by Jacob's friends and supporters. Banners reading "Healthcare for All" and "Justice for Jacob" adorned the walls, and the air buzzed with energy. Monique Daniels took the stage, her voice firm yet emotional. "What happened to my brother isn't an isolated incident," she declared. "It's a symptom of a broken system, a system that sees people like us as less deserving of care." Applause erupted, and tears glistened in the eyes of many attendees. Among them was Amanda, the nurse who had intervened to save Jacob's life. She felt a surge of pride as she listened, vowing to continue advocating for change within the healthcare system. At her apartment, Sarah sat in the dim light of her living room, her once pristine uniform now folded in a box. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional buzz of her phone. She glanced at a voicemail notification from her closest friend, Linda. "Sarah," the message began, "I don't know what to say. I can't believe what I've been hearing. Call me when you're ready to talk." Her mother's words from a previous phone call echoed in her mind. "Maybe it's time to face the truth about yourself, Sarah." Desperate for clarity, Sarah reached out to Dr. Carol Benson, a mentor from her nursing school days. In a cozy cafe away from the media frenzy, Sarah sat across from Dr. Benson, who sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I've seen the video," Dr. Benson began. "Sarah, this is serious. But more importantly, it's an opportunity for you to reflect." Sarah's voice cracked as she replied, "I don't know where to start. I didn't mean to." Dr. Benson held up a hand, her expression firm but compassionate. "Intentions matter, Sarah, but so do actions. The fact is, you dismissed a man in need because of preconceived notions. Why?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I guess I've always thought people like him exaggerate their problems. But now I see how wrong I was." Dr. Benson leaned forward. "Acknowledging that is the first step. But it's not enough. You need to do the work. Educate yourself, listen to others, and confront the biases you've been carrying." Back at the hospital, Jacob lay in his bed, recovering slowly. Despite his physical pain, his mind was sharp, focused on the fight ahead. When Amanda visited, he smiled weakly. "Thanks for saving my life," he said. Amanda shook her head. "You saved your own life, Jacob. Your strength, your advocacy, it's inspiring. People are rallying behind you." Jacob's gaze softened. "I just hope this leads to real change," he said. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's been overlooked or dismissed." That night, Sarah opened her laptop and began researching healthcare disparities and systemic racism. The stories she read were sobering, each one a mirror reflecting her own actions. She watched videos of Jacob's speeches, his passion and conviction stirring something deep within her. For the first time, Sarah saw the world through a different lens, a lens that didn't center her own experiences, but instead illuminated the struggles of others. As the sun rose, Sarah drafted an email to Jacob's family, apologizing for her actions and expressing her commitment to making amends. The hospital's main conference room was packed to capacity, a tense murmur filling the air. Doctors, nurses, patients, community members, and reporters occupied every seat, their gazes shifting between the stage and the empty chair reserved for Sarah Montgomery. At the head of the room, a panel of hospital administrators sat behind a long table. The review meeting had been called to address the fallout of Jacob Daniels' case, the events of which had ignited a firestorm of public outrage. Jacob, now partially recovered and walking with a cane, sat in the front row. His presence alone commanded attention, his quiet strength evident in his composed demeanor. The murmurs hushed as Sarah entered, her face pale, her shoulders slouched. She avoided the gazes of the crowd as she took her seat on the stage, opposite Jacob. The tension in the room was palpable, like the calm before a storm. The moderator, a senior hospital administrator, adjusted her microphone. "We begin with Mr. Daniels, who has graciously agreed to share his perspective." Jacob rose slowly, leaning on his cane as he approached the podium. He paused, surveying the room with measured calm before speaking. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today," he began, his voice steady yet resonant. "I stand here not just as an individual who was wronged, but as a representative of countless others who have experienced similar injustices." He locked eyes with Sarah for a fleeting moment before continuing. "When I came to this hospital, I wasn't seeking special treatment. I was seeking the care every human being deserves. But instead I was met with indifference, a decision made not because of the severity of my condition, but because of the color of my skin." A ripple of unease passed through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jacob's voice grew firmer, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Prejudice in healthcare isn't just an individual failure. It's a systemic issue, a disease that infects institutions, policies, and attitudes. And every time we ignore it, every time we let it slide, we allow it to spread." He turned toward the panel, his gaze unwavering. "But let me be clear, I am not here to point fingers or to condemn. I am here to demand accountability and to advocate for change. Because no one else should have to endure what I did." As Jacob returned to his seat, the room erupted in applause, some members of the audience standing to show their support. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands trembling as the moderator called her name. "Ms. Montgomery, you now have the floor." Sarah approached the podium hesitantly, the weight of the room's judgment pressing down on her. She gripped the edges of the stand, her knuckles white, and took a shaky breath. I don't know where to begin," she started, her voice cracking. "There's no excuse for what I did. None. And I'm not here to defend myself." Her gaze flicked to Jacob, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mr. Daniels, I am so deeply sorry for the pain I caused you and your family. I failed you in the worst way imaginable, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life." The room was silent, every ear tuned to her words. "I want to be honest," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "I've spent the last few weeks confronting parts of myself I didn't want to see, biases I didn't think I had. I see now how dangerous those biases are, how they blind us to the humanity in others. And I know that saying sorry isn't enough, it will never be enough." She paused, wiping her eyes before meeting the audience's gaze. "But I am committed to doing the work, to listening, learning, and changing. Because I don't want to be part of the problem anymore. I want to be part of the solution." After Sarah's speech, the moderator opened the floor for discussion. Jacob raised his hand and was given the microphone. "Ms. Montgomery," he began, his tone even but firm, "I accept your apology. But accountability isn't just about words, it's about action. Are you prepared to do what it takes to make this right? Not just for me, but for every patient who walks through these doors." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, whatever it takes." Jacob held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to the crowd. "This isn't just about one nurse or one patient. This is about a system that needs to change, a system that needs to see every person as worthy of dignity and care." In the weeks following the meeting, the hospital began implementing significant changes. Diversity and bias training became mandatory for all staff. A new oversight committee, spearheaded by Jacob, was formed to ensure equitable treatment of all patients. Jacob's recovery was slow but steady, and he used his platform to advocate for healthcare reform, speaking at conferences and rallies. His speeches inspired action, sparking discussions about systemic bias across the medical community. Sarah, true to her word, enrolled in educational programs and began volunteering at community clinics. Though she faced ongoing scrutiny, she worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and contribute positively to the field she had once tainted. Months later, Jacob and Sarah crossed paths at a community health fair organized by the hospital. "Mr. Daniels," Sarah said, her voice soft but sincere, "I didn't think I'd see you here." Jacob smiled faintly. "I wouldn't miss it. This is what change looks like." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history lingering between them. "Thank you," Sarah said finally, "for giving me a chance to do better." Jacob nodded. "Keep doing the work, Ms. Montgomery. It's not about me, it's about everyone." As Sarah watched Jacob walk away, she felt a flicker of hope. Change was possible, but it was a journey she was finally ready to take. The dim light of the early morning filtered into a small, crowded clinic on the outskirts of town. Sarah Montgomery stood at the reception desk, sorting through a stack of patient files. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, and the soft hum of voices echoed through the narrow hallways. Gone were the crisp white walls and polished floors of the urban hospital. This clinic, serving a predominantly underserved community, was a far cry from Sarah's previous workplace. But to Sarah, it felt exactly where she needed to be. Ms. Montgomery, a young mother, called from the waiting area, holding a toddler with flushed cheeks. "Thank you for seeing us so early." Sarah offered a warm smile, kneeling to the child's level. "It's no trouble. Let's make sure he's feeling better soon." As Sarah led them into the examination room, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't penance, it was a step toward change. She was working to rebuild the trust she'd once shattered, one patient at a time. Across town, Jacob Daniels adjusted the microphone on a podium set up in a park. The rally was small but growing, with community members gathering to hear his message. Signs reading "Healthcare for All" and "End Discrimination in Medicine" dotted the crowd. Jacob took a deep breath, scanning the faces before him. Many were familiar, neighbors, activists, and even a few doctors and nurses from the hospital. But one face stood out. In the back of the crowd, partially hidden by a low-hanging tree branch, stood Sarah. She wasn't carrying a sign, nor was she mingling with the other attendees. She simply watched, her gaze intent. Jacob's voice carried over the crowd, steady and resolute. "Healthcare is a human right. But too often, systemic biases deny people that right. It's not enough to treat symptoms, we must address the root causes." Applause rippled through the crowd, but Jacob raised his hand to quiet them. This is not a fight for one person or one community. It's for everyone. And it's a fight that requires us to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge ourselves, and to hold each other accountable. Back at the hospital, a staff meeting was underway. The room was filled with doctors, nurses, administrators, and support staff, their faces somber as the hospital director addressed them. "The incident involving Mr. Daniels was a wake-up call," she said, her tone grave. "We failed not only as individuals but as an institution. That cannot happen again." Heads nodded around the room, the weight of her words settling in. The director continued, outlining new policies: mandatory bias training, increased accountability measures, and a dedicated diversity and inclusion team. Among the attendees was Dr. Patel, a senior physician who had been one of the few to speak out against Sarah's actions on that fateful night. He stood to address the room, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about new policies," he said. "It's about culture, about creating a space where every patient is treated with dignity and every staff member feels empowered to stand up against injustice." The rally had ended, and the crowd dispersed, but Sarah remained rooted in place. Jacob noticed her lingering and walked over, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Sarah looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I didn't think I belonged here." Jacob's gaze softened. "The fact that you're here says otherwise." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice quiet. "I've been volunteering at the clinic," she said. "It's small, but I'm learning what it means to truly serve people." Jacob nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a good start. But remember, change isn't just about what you do, it's about who you are." Weeks later, Sarah attended another rally, this time as a volunteer. She handed out water bottles, organized supplies, and quietly listened as speakers took the stage. When Jacob's turn came, she watched from the sidelines, her chest tightening with emotion. Jacob's voice rang out, filled with passion and conviction. "We've come a long way, but there's still so much work to do. The fight for justice is a marathon, not a sprint. And it's a fight that belongs to all of us." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Sarah barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on Jacob, the man she had wronged, who had every reason to hate her, but who had chosen instead to inspire her. As the rally ended, Jacob approached her, his smile warm but faintly weary. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing to the empty water bottles and neatly stacked signs. Sarah smiled back, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'm trying." Jacob's response was simple but profound. "Keep going." As the sun set, Sarah walked away from the rally, her steps lighter than they had been in months. She wasn't the same person she had been on that fateful night. And while the journey ahead was long, she was ready to face it. Meanwhile, Jacob watched her go, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. The scars of their shared experience would never fully heal, but they had planted the seeds of something greater: understanding, accountability, and the hope for a better future. Together, in their own ways, they were proving that even the most fractured relationships could pave the way for change. As Jacob stood on the stage at the healthcare reform rally, his voice resonated with hope and determination. "Change starts here, with us," he declared, the crowd roaring in agreement. Among them stood Sarah, humbled but resolute, silently committing herself to the same fight. Their paths, once divided by prejudice, now aligned in a shared pursuit of justice and compassion. The journey wasn't over, but it was a start, proof that even the darkest moments can lead to brighter futures. If you were in Jacob's shoes, how would you respond to Sarah's apology? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.